I'd also like to hand over and introduce our presenters for today, Dr. Karen Angus-Cole, Lecturer and Director of Studies and Education at the University of Bath, and Abby Osborne, Curriculum Development Officer, also from the University of Bath.
Thank you, James. Hi, everyone. It's really great to be here today. Abby and I are really thankful to be able to speak to you. It's afternoon here in the UK, but wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for joining us. It's great to have you here. So the first thing that we'd like to do is to have a little think about what you consider metacognition to be. So this is just kind of a little starter activity. So our question to you is, which key attributes help to support learners with metacognition? So there's a Menti code on the slide that you should be able to see in front of you. So if you go to menti.com and you enter that code, you'll be able to start inputting your ideas around this particular question. So we'll give you a few moments to be able to access the Menti, to access the code and to input your ideas. And then after that, we'll switch to the slide and see what things you've come through with. James, have we got anything coming through in the Menti so far?
Yes, we have. Let me just put that up there for you.
Thank you. Fantastic. Thanks, James. So we should be able to see now on the screen, and your answers can keep coming through. Some of the keywords that you're noting that are attributes which help to support learners with metacognition. So you can see in the middle, we've got words such as reflection and reflective coming up quite a lot, confidence and questioning, curiosity I can see in there, and critical thinking, teacher scaffolding, which is really important, planning, motivation. What else have we got? Awareness of how we learn, thinking, problem solving skills, exploring. Okay, so evaluating and confidence. So there's loads of really interesting skills and attributes there that you think your learners are going to draw on when they're engaging with the process of metacognition. And what we're interested to see is that a lot of these words that you've come up with, a lot of these skills, these attributes that you've come up with, actually linked to what we're going to be talking about in this workshop today around this approach to metacognition that we call well-doing. So the idea behind well-doing links to supporting students to develop and gain such attributes to help them with metacognition. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Abby, who's going to introduce well-doing so we can learn about it over the next 50 minutes or so. Abby, you there? Okay, not sure if you've lost Abby. So let's just go here. Abby, if you do come back in, just feel free to interrupt me. But James, you can hear me, correct?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you, Karen.
Okay, that's fine. I'm just checking that it's not me who's disconnected, and then potentially, yeah, I'm talking to myself. Okay, so hopefully Abby will join us shortly. But the idea behind what we call well-doing is the idea that we know that you're busy as teachers or as leaders, and you can feel pulled in multiple directions. And sometimes it can feel like you have a really long to-do list to be able to kind of address all of the things that you know are important in supporting your learners with their learning. Things like metacognition, supporting students' resilience, their well-being, providing for SEN students, and inclusive practice, meeting all your targets, deadlines, etc. And so you're really time pressed. So we want to introduce you to well-doing, and I can see Abby, you're able to join us now. Yes?
I'm here now. Apologies.
Great, and you can hear us.
Yeah, I had to move from my PC set up in the office to my my trusty laptop, so apologies for my late arrival there. But thankfully I can hear you all now. So Karen, you've done a brilliant job. I hope it sounds like it of starting us off. But just to reiterate what Karen is saying, that we really are trying to start with a very kind of realistic starting point for teachers, and teachers are often pulled in multiple directions, having to excited about the opportunity that working with learners on their metacognition presents, but that can also ultimately lead to teachers feeling that they've got to juggle, metacognition for students with special educational needs, metacognition for students who are high achieving, and support everybody also in between, everybody throughout the classroom. And also teachers can feel that they've got to support student autonomy, develop those skills of lifelong learning, resilience, and so that can be a very overwhelming starting point for the teacher, where it feels that there are multiple strands to do in addition to your day job. So we wanted today to introduce this idea of well-doing, okay? And basically well-doing is an approach that we've developed over a number of years with practitioners like yourselves, but also with students, as a way of addressing some of these issues in the classroom and really supporting the teacher to support students to learn in a way that is highly effective and also highly efficient as well. All right, so in the session today, what we're going to do is we're going to give you a brief introduction to well-doing. So we'll set out what does well-doing mean, and then when we've considered that, we'll actually look about, well, okay, lovely, that sounds great, but how do we go about embedding that in the classroom? And what we'd like to do today is to give you 3 practical examples of the well-doing approach that we hope you could take and apply to your own teaching and learning context, to your own classrooms, to your own schools. And those are called comfortable learning, and then we'll move on to talk about thinking spaces, and finally we'll introduce you to the rather strangely named cake and explain how these strategies can support student well-doing. All right, so a bit of an introduction to well-doing then. So as we've said, for us, well-doing has enabled us, when working both with teaching staff and with pupils, to really support pupil metacognition, but also to really support student resilience and learner autonomy as well. So it's a tool that enables us to do several things simultaneously, ultimately. And in terms of the well-doing ethos then, well-doing offers us a really flexible and tailored approach that we can apply in any classroom, at any sort of age, linked to any subject context. And it empowers learners to really personalise and take greater control and ownership of their learning. And in that sense, and something we can look at throughout this session, it kind of takes it a step further. So the onus isn't purely on the teacher to differentiate the student learning journey and the student outcomes, but the pupils themselves can actually start to differentiate their own learning journey, their own learning experience, and actually ultimately work towards the same or similar goals, but just change the way in which they get there and shape that process. And that helps us also to lead to the development of long-term habits that have real impact as well. So, sorry, just wait for the slide to move on, bit of a delay. What is well-doing then? So, okay, fundamentally, it's a set of practical strategies, okay, really tangible, practical things that you can apply in the classroom. And what we do with well-doing is that actually we're interested in directly supporting well-being via our everyday actions in learning. Now, many of you will have heard about well-being and the importance of addressing this in our classrooms, and this is becoming a real challenge for contemporary teachers throughout the world. But one of the issues for us is that well-being tends to be positioned as this antidote to the stresses and pressures of teaching, of learning, of kind of the outcome of that sort of stress that we might experience whilst learning. But actually what that does is it almost separates out learning and well-being as something that we can't as if those two things don't link together. And what we've come to kind of realise in the last few years in our work is that actually learning and well-being go hand in hand wonderfully. And what is well-doing, okay? So that you support all learners to do well, but instead of well-being being something that students might have to tackle at the end of the day by using something like a mindfulness app or going on a walk or doing some exercise, we try to support teachers to support well-being directly through the learning process. Okay, so a student is basically, we're equipping them to learn to utilize their brain and make the most of the brain they've been given in the classroom context, which actually ultimately leads to better well-being because you're equipping the individual student with those tools to support their own well-being. Okay. So I'm just going to pass over to Karen now, who's going to talk us through why well-doing is important.
Thanks, Abby. So yeah, Abby's just explained what well-doing is, but we need to think about when we apply approaches in our classroom, when we adopt different approaches, we need to understand why they're important and why we might be bringing them into the classroom. So one of the things that you may have noticed with your own learners, and maybe even in your own learning as learners yourselves, is that sometimes you may not, or your learners may not approach learning in the most effective way. So for example, have you ever felt or have you ever seen your learners putting in huge amounts of effort but not actually progressing in their learning? And this is often through no fault of their own, but learners are not potentially always equipped with the strategies that work best for them. And so by using well-doing, we can help learners to be able to recognize what is going to work for them so that the effort that they put in does help to lead to progress in their learning. And one of the issues that can happen over time is that learners can sometimes develop habits that do lead to progress, but actually these might be unsustainable. So for example, you may have learners who work for very, very long hours all weekend, and therefore they're incredibly tired. And so that's not particularly sustainable, and there may be other ways in which they can approach their learning and develop alternative habits which are actually much more sustainable and therefore allow them to learn, but also allow them to address well-being at the same time, so that they're not sacrificing their well-being whilst they are putting their learning as a priority. And we know learning is important, but also we know that allowing our students to find ways to learn which are beneficial for their health is also really, really important. There are, to make that clearer, the ideas around learner effort. If you're putting in lots of effort and that's not getting you anywhere, you can see how well-being could be impacted in terms of students getting stressed or feeling incredibly frustrated that they're trying really hard and not actually making as much progress as they might want to. We don't want our learners to just survive in their learning, but we want them to have approaches that they can adopt that allow them to thrive. And we want them to be able to be in a safe space in the classroom where they can take risks and find what works best for them in a supportive learning environment. And the well-doing approaches and strategies that we'll share with you today will help you to see how you could support your students to reflect on the way in which they approach their learning and then choose particular strategies which are going to work for them and their particular learning context. So that leads us as well to just thinking about the Cambridge Learner attributes. So our well-doing strategies explicitly support the development of Cambridge Learner attributes, particularly around encouraging students to become responsible for themselves and also to become reflective as learners and developing their ability to learn. Thinking about thinking, the key feature of this conference series, is definitely supported by the well-doing strategies. It also encourages learners to be innovative. So we share strategies with you as teachers to then support your learners, but also these strategies can be adapted and they are flexible. So they're not fixed strategies. And so learners can take the strategy and use it in a way that works best for them. And this then encourages them to engage intellectually with their own learning and see the idea of thinking about thinking and reflecting on their learning as something that can be really beneficial to them and a key attribute that will support them with lifelong learning. With well-doing strategies, the key here is that they also support all learners to do well, including any of your learners that have special educational needs. This promotes inclusivity in your classroom. Sometimes we can feel as a teacher that maybe we're not equipped to support our students who have labelled special educational needs, something that is additional, as Abby was talking about earlier. But actually, by embedding these strategies, we can support all of our learners, not just those with SEN, and we can integrate that into our classroom practice, embedding inclusivity into our classrooms and ensuring that all learners, even those who are doing well, those that might need to be stretched and need to be challenged further, well-doing strategies can allow all learners to reach their full potential. Abby, do you want to talk to us a bit about patterns beyond labels?
Thanks, Karen. So I just wanted to briefly outline a kind of way of thinking that aligns itself very well with the well-doing approach. And as Karen says, this is really what's important here, is that the needs of students with special educational needs are often not distinctly different to those needs of all children in the classroom. But I guess that sometimes students may struggle to a greater degree. But as I say, the challenges tend to be, you see those across the student cohort. So when we're thinking about well-doing, one thing we can do is to establish what we refer to as patterns beyond labels. And labels are vital in the education system because they enable learners to access special educational needs provision, special exam arrangements. But it can feel very tricky, again, for the teacher if you're having to respond to multiple labels and students who are potentially presenting with different needs. But if we shift beyond that label and actually looked at the impact on learning, what we tend to find is, as I say, that across the cohort, you'll start to see patterns. So regardless of if a student has a diagnosis for, say, anxiety or for dyslexia or for maybe ADHD, what we'll find is that potentially that group of students may be challenged in terms of their ability to concentrate for long periods of time. And that's not something that's not similar for all of our learners at certain times. So by engaging with the idea of patterns beyond labels, we can start to identify needs across the cohort that we can then start to problem solve working with students. The other thing that's very important about this approach is that actually this enables us to anticipate barriers to learning. So you're not just reacting to a challenge when it presents itself, when a student hits a hurdle, but you're actually able to anticipate what kind of challenges your learners may face. And that actually is also very useful because you can draw on your learning context, no matter where you're teaching and what subject you're teaching, to really kind of tailor your problem solving linked to metacognition, and by identifying, as I say, patterns beyond labels. Okay, so we've done a bit of an introduction to well-doing and explained the kind of ethos, what it constitutes and why it's important. In the next part of this section, we're going to explore how we can actually embed well-doing in the classroom. Okay, how can we make this something practical and transferable that you can draw upon for your teaching practice? So when we're thinking about metacognition and thinking about thinking, I think we would all agree that it's important to encourage student reflection and individuals to try different strategies. I think what is vital to well-doing is that we recognise it's not just the strategies learners are using that are important, but it's their ability to move flexibly from one way of working or from one way of thinking and learning to another. And that's the bit that gives students resilience. That's the bit that builds student autonomy and leads to student success, so that they're actually recognising when a strategy is not working for them. So we identified two key features with well-doing, and when you're trying out well-doing, something you'd like to explore in your classroom, it's really important to get students therefore to pick and mix their strategies. Okay, so just as a pupil might pick and mix sweets in a sweet shop, we would really encourage them to really start to think about what's working for them, what's not working for them, because a fundamental feature of learning is actually to step away from a way of working when it's not working for us. Okay, and alongside that, we would also encourage students to combine strategies. And what we've realised is that we can think of metacognition on quite a macro level, but it's really important to think about metacognition and at a very nuanced level in terms of the fine detail of what a student is doing. So by picking and mixing some strategies and combining strategies, a student will therefore be better placed to take control and ownership of that learning. And that doesn't have to be something radical, it doesn't have to be something huge. It could be as small as simply deciding to change the type of paper that a student is working on, or thinking about working on using a different pen or a different colour filter. And those small changes are really, really important. And as we say, a student can combine and almost layer those strategies just as you would in a burger. Okay, so we're going to go through 3 different areas where we think you could have a go at trying the well-doing approach. There are multiple possibilities for well-doing, but we felt that these are 3 that could be very useful and potentially quite impactful whilst you're working as a teacher in busy classrooms. So we're going to first of all touch on comfy learning or comfortable learning, and I'm going to pass back over to Karen.
Thank you, Abby. So yeah, firstly, we'll look at comfortable learning, or we tend to call it comfy learning. And this is about maximising students' learning potential. So in a classroom, there's obviously the physical classroom, there's the desk, the chair, there's the seats that students are sat in. But as well as considering whether students feel comfortable with the things that they're maybe touching in their classroom, about cognitive comfort. It's something that we've come to realize, and this comes from our own experiences as well as those from learners that we've been interacting with and supporting over the past few years. And the idea here is that obviously we might need a desk, something to write on, we might need lighting in the classroom, but the environment which learners are in can really impact on their ability to think and assimilate new ideas. So that impacts on their cognition. So we can have a stereotypical environment where we would consider it a good learning environment. For example, sat straight up at a desk, bright lights on, tidy desk with paper in the middle, pens to the side, for example, everybody facing the front. But actually, everybody has different needs, and that's okay. Even Abby and I have different needs. We've shared an office and worked together, and our interaction with light is very different. I like quite bright light, whereas Abby likes soft light. So that can make it difficult. And we recognize that you can't necessarily relate to everybody's individual needs, which we'll come back to shortly. But the idea here is that we know that, for example, the environment has a strong impact on students potentially with ADHD due to sensory overload, for example. But actually, maybe the environment is impacting on a shy student because sensory input might be impacting on their anxiety. We're not saying it's the teacher who has to put everything in place. What we're saying here is that we would encourage students to stop and think, just like was mentioned in the conference keynote. Stop and think, what is it about the environment that helps you to stay focused? What is it about the environment that distracts you? This helps students to think about their thinking, and by encouraging your students to stop and think, you can help them to support themselves to be able to take ownership. So, for example, if we look at the senses, how we sense our environment impacts on how we can access and engage with our learning. So, is your classroom near the canteen, for example? So, at a particular time of day, will your students be able to smell the cooking of food? Is that going to distract them? Would shutting the door at this time be helpful to keep the scent out, which may be distracting your learners and affecting their ability to engage with their learning? Do some of your students feel restricted in their uniform? Could you ask them this? Is there anything that they could do to alleviate this? Is the pen even that the students are holding in their hand, does that feel nice to them, or does it feel maybe scratchy, too hard, too soft? Could they be encouraged to experiment with different pens, even a pencil, even the feel of how a pen or a pencil moves across a page? This shouldn't affect their ability to be able to actually write, so they can still output the things that you might want them to output, but actually just giving them the opportunity to think and reflect about this can help them to remove those distractions, which then interfere with their ability to cognitively engage with their learning. For example, background noise, such as a ticking of a clock, I know personally that can be difficult for me. So maybe if that was something in the classroom, a learner could say, actually, I'm sat very close to the clock, I'm finding it distracting. Is there any way in which I might be able to move to a different part of the classroom? Again, with light intensity, some students may be sat near a window and find that natural light beneficial, whereas others may prefer to be within the classroom and be exposed more to some of the artificial light from the lights. Obviously, as we say, everybody has different needs, but the idea here is to get students to think really carefully about what is impacting on them and not just saying, oh, I feel distracted, oh, I can't learn, but what could they do, what could be altered to potentially support them to be comfortable in their learning through this common sensory approach as one way in to consider how to get comfy cognitively and also physically. So, as I said we'd come back to this. We know that you're not able to address every single individual learner needs. We can't do that in a classroom of 30, 40 children, for example. But the idea is to just equip learners, to scaffold them, to help them to think about how they might make small changes to their learning environment to be able to accommodate these. So this is the idea of, if I was individually on my own, I could manage the environment, I could switch the light on, that's fine. But actually, maybe your students will be able to micro manage their environment. So they could change the color of the pen that they're using if they're finding that black ink on white paper is distracting, is something that is they're not feeling particularly comfortable with. Maybe they even things like changing their paper so that it's landscape orientation rather than portrait. Does that help them? Could there be zones made in the classroom where you could allow students to go to work in silence, or a zone where students are allowed to talk? That could be moving to a place where some students might need silence, some students might need background noise. So there's lots of different things, but obviously we need to be realistic. We want to ensure that in a classroom setting, comfortable learning is adopted and scaffolded by teachers in a way that's realistic and sustainable. But it's not reactionary, as Abby spoke about previously. It's solution focused. It's allowing students to think, I can't work at the moment, but why is that? And what small things could I change to the environment to get comfortable and to allow me to focus on my learning? So that leads us to ask you a question. Can you think, based on what we've just spoken about around comfortable learning, of any examples of how you already adopt the comfortable learning approach in your own context? As we said before, these well-doing strategies should be transferable across all subjects and all age ranges, and that's one of the key benefits of them in terms of them being adaptable, flexible, and transferable. So what we'd like you to do is we'd like you to share your ideas in the chat, and actually your examples could come from classroom examples of comfortable learning, or even reflections on your own learning. And remember, this is something that you could get your students to do as well and get them to really concretely identify what they do to support themselves to be comfortable in their learning. So please post any ideas that you've got in the chat around how you already adopt comfortable learning in your own context. Yes, definitely, Maria. So we're not saying here that your classroom needs to turn into chaos. Definitely ground rules are important. So you're still the teacher. You still set the ground rules, but you can potentially do so in a way that might work for your learners. I can definitely think of situations where zones might work with some of my students, but may not have worked better with other students. Allowing students to choose their own group.
Just going to add to that, Karen, I think that's a really great point, and that's where the emphasis can also be placed on the student, because sometimes we have to work in an environment that's not supportive or conducive to the most effective learning. So we can encourage the student to make those small little changes that we talked about as well.
Great, thanks, Abby. There's some really fantastic ideas coming through in the chat, and there are also reflections on things that our participants themselves do. So I've noticed that Tina plays music every time they want to learn. And so actually, Abby and I break that down a bit further into what music do we want to listen to. Sometimes we're in the mood for quite loud music, sometimes we're in the mood for softer music, maybe classical, maybe music with lyrics. And this is what we mean by being flexible. So it's really great that Tina's recognized that they need music to learn, but then it's then taking a next step and making it even more nuanced. What music do I need today? Because it may not be the same as what I needed yesterday.
Exactly, that can shift and change, and we've also worked with many students who find something like white noise can be really useful to boost their cognition as well. So it's just being really flexible about the kind of at that micro level that we were talking about, and one small change can have a huge impact. Really nice suggestions as well, Karen, about dance and jumping and movement. And again, we encourage students to micromanage that by making small movements. If it's not appropriate for them to leap around the classroom, is it appropriate for them to fiddle push their toes into their shoes, or have a pen that they enjoy holding that will help them to focus? What other kinds of movement can we engage students in?
Great, yeah. And then we've got ideas around here about how the classroom arrangement is important and the classroom decor is also important. So some students can find it really distracting to have lots of things on the wall. So you may have areas of the classroom where you have quite blank walls without displays, and you may have areas where you have displays of student work, but you have both so that students can engage with the part of the classroom which they need to at that particular point in time. Some of them may feel overwhelmed by visual stimuli, and so if there's a blank part of the wall that they can focus on, that could help to clear their head and reduce the cognitive discomfort that they're feeling at that time. Abby, do you want to pick up on any final point before we move on, just cognizant of time?
Yeah, just thinking about what's really lovely to see from the chat is the range of responses, and that you've obviously already thought about this and thought about how environment impacts on a learner's ability to concentrate and focus. A nice suggestion there about temperature. I think that's really lovely, not overlooking that, and again providing students with greater autonomy over that. And students changing resources as well. I have to say there's some really amazing suggestions and things that Karen and I can certainly add to our toolkit. I was just going to share one example, how sometimes something really small can have a really significant impact on a student. And working, for example, with students with SEN, I've noticed things like just a student cutting out a label that's itching them, or tightness of some clothing. Things like that can also really impact on a learner's ability to concentrate. So it's kind of our job, in a sense, to work with students to be problem solvers in this space, and to make those really small but potentially big impactful changes. There's great suggestions and they just keep coming.
Yeah, they're really great. Thank you, everyone. So we're going to move on just because we have to, and we want to share a couple more well-doing strategies with you. So we've got 2 more. So I'm going to pass over to Abby now, who's going to talk to you about thinking spaces.
Thanks, Karen. So just as we've all started to share our strategies for thinking about the environment in which we're learning in terms of the classroom or the school more generally, I think it's really useful to also think differently about a page. And we started referring to pages, whether that be physical or digital, as thinking spaces. And these are spaces that ultimately shape a student's cognition, shape their ability to engage, their ability to focus, their motivation. And sometimes we can think of a blank page as somewhere to output and produce writing. But I think it's also important to remember that what's happening on that page is a relationship between the page and the space on that page and the individual learner's cognition. Their metacognition. And so that space, in terms of that space, not only is a student producing words, writing, paragraphs, but they could also be producing drawing, images. But they're also capturing their very thoughts. They're arranging and sequencing those thoughts, whether that is in terms of working out which paragraph should go in which order, or even a younger child thinking about what order they might arrange words in a specific sentence. So a lot is going on in that space other than just the writing or drawing output. It's actually a space where we're thinking, we're developing our thinking, and we're then editing or polishing our ideas. So something that Karen and I have both done, and again, which we both use ourselves, I use it with my own children as well, is that we really like to focus on how are we interacting with the space on a page, and how might we shift and change that to better boost our cognition. So we have some examples here on the next slide, and mind maps are very popular in schools and used a lot by students. But mind maps can actually, ironically for some students, be incredibly overwhelming. A mind map enables you to see the big picture. It enables you to link different ideas together, but it can also at the same time overwhelm a student. A student might get something which we call analysis paralysis, where they have too many great ideas, or they can't see how everything's going to slot together to produce their piece of work. So what we've tried to do is think of, again, thinking about that micro approach to metacognition in the classroom. How can we better equip our students to scaffold and shape their thinking spaces? And that might be thinking about, well, actually, I find it easier to work digitally than I do on a piece of paper. That might be thinking about using a writing table as opposed to a mind map. A table gives a student boxes to fill in. Each box breaks down the tasks, enables them to focus on a specific type of work or type of thinking, and stops them then becoming overwhelmed. We might also like to use something like colour coding. Karen and I use colours a lot with students so that a student can actually have that greater autonomy over the work they're producing. They might like to traffic light their work, so that the idea is that not everything we write is wonderful. We might want to polish and edit some of those bits. But instead of hitting delete and getting rid of those ideas, there might be some wonderful ideas on the page. So you could encourage a student to put red where there's a great idea, but it needs to be, they want to do a little bit more work to strengthen that idea. Or orange where they might like to adapt or alter the language they're using, change the focus of an individual word. And then green when they're happy and that actually that's really how I want this to sound or look. You might also encourage students to use what we call the washing line technique, which I know is popular in a lot of schools. And the benefit of that is you're essentially enabling students to separate out their ideas and then physically move them around. Any of you that have had to write a report, or I've had to write a couple of essays recently, a couple of articles, it can be really hard to generate all these ideas and then think, oh, how would I then order these? How would I sequence these? So the washing line technique, or using sticky notes as well, lets you really change the way that you're interacting with those ideas. So you're physically moving them. So not only does this work, as I say, for our students in our classrooms, but it can also really help us to think about how we're interacting with space on a page as well. So what we'd like you to do is to have a think about, and really this is just a moment for your own reflection, so we won't share these in the chat, but we'd like you to think about opportunities in your own classroom where you are already adopting that kind of thinking spaces approach. You might not be calling it, but where are you using different types of scaffolds for students to boost their learning? It might be that you want to think about it in terms of your own thinking. Do you have a particular preference for making notes in a linear form or in a diagrammatic form? So think about how you're applying it either in the classroom or actually to your own learning, because it can make us all much more efficient in terms of our thinking. So we'll just leave you for a moment now to have a reflection about that. There are actually some lovely strategies coming through, so either do feel free to just reflect or to actually share ideas. Love the idea of concept mapping. I've worked with students where they've done incredible concept maps through like somebody else has just said there, lovely, through doodling, through sketching. We've got drawing 3D objects, fantastic. So what you're doing there again is not only between you are you picking and mixing strategies, but you're also, what we said about combining them. So you're thinking about, could I get a student to use a table with colour coding? Next week they might want to use something else. Think, pair, share, lovely example. Yeah, really good. You're actually creating a cognitive space for students to verbalise their thinking. That's wonderful. Yeah, flow diagrams, Padlet, really been enjoying using Padlet throughout the lockdowns. Yeah, lots of colour coding, some superb ideas, and I really like predict, observe, explain. Actually, that's something I haven't done in my teaching, so that's a strategy I will be looking into in more detail. Lovely. All right, so some great ideas there. And just as a really kind of, again, just a kind of key point when thinking about metacognition at this micro level and supporting a student's well-doing, it's really important to remind students, because we all establish working habits and sometimes we forget to go to a strategy. So even when Karen and I are writing together, we'll hit a wall and we'll have to remind one another to let's go into a table, let's use color coding. No, it's not working on the doing this digitally. Let's get a big sheet of paper and put that on the floor. So we will always encourage each other to move and shift direction. And it's amazing how that can just immediately remove a barrier to learning for multiple pupils in multiple contexts. And as I say, I've used this with my own daughter, who who in terms of a sort of a high achieving student who actually it can enable a student's thinking to become even more effective. So you can actually push students more ironically as well. So it's really nice and works across the board for all learners. And as teachers as well, saves our sanity as well and saves us time if we can learn to work in really creative and flexible ways. Okay, so the final strategy or approach rather we're going to introduce you to today is called CAKE, and this works. In fact, this works really nicely if we're talking about layering and pick and mixing. You could combine the comfortable learning approach with something from thinking spaces and actually also add in the CAKE strategy or approach as well. So CAKE, you may be asking, what am I talking about? I want to just use with you an analogy from baking or from cooking. So if you think about, if you are making a cake, okay, and you think about the steps that you would go through when making that cake. Well, first of all, you would gather together your ingredients, okay, and you would bring those all together to think about what am I actually going to make this cake out of. And when you've got those ideas in front of you, you would then arrange and mix together those ideas so that you're actually forming a cohesive cake, a cake that looks and tastes good and that works, okay. And when you've then put that cake together and mix those ingredients, you might like to think about how you're going to layer that, how you're going to transfer it to the pan to be cooked, and you're going to bake cake and you're going to check on it and maybe add additional bits and watch that cake develop, okay. And then finally, and potentially most importantly, when the cake's cooled and it's ready, you then polish you polish or decorate that cake. Okay, now imagine a different scenario, and you're trying to bake a cake, but you do those steps simultaneously, all right? The cake is likely to be inedible to begin with, and is not likely to work as we intended. But now I want to flip back to a classroom, and what tends to happen because of just the natural way in which our students tend to work and progress, and because we're all busy and pressured, sometimes what we find is that our students are actually expected to do all of those things simultaneously. They're expected to capture their ideas, polish their ideas, check your spelling as you're writing your first sentence. So we've come up with CAKE as a reminder that actually there are different ways of approaching thinking and writing. And I certainly, for one, find now that I will think about the polish for my writing or how I'm going to decorate my ideas, but right at the end. So we're just going to introduce you to CAKE. And fundamentally, CAKE has 4 stages, all right? So CAKE, stage 1, is you enable your students to just capture their ideas. And you say to them, don't worry about your spelling, don't worry about your punctuation. And that sounds, potentially terrifying. We're not saying get rid of that, because that's fundamental. And if you don't make your writing look good, nobody would like a cake, nobody wants to taste it and eat it. But we're saying to free your thinking up, capture your ideas first, because that's what we're really interested in. We're interested in your thinking. And when you've captured those ideas, start to then arrange those ideas in order. What sequence would you produce those ideas in to appeal to and engage with your audience? Then you might like to say to students for CAKE, think about your keywords, think about your phrases. How are you going to enable your learners to jump, your audience to jump from one idea to the next? And then finally, when you've done all of that, make your writing look beautiful, make it look tasty and good enough to eat. And that's where you really encourage students to recognize the importance of polishing their ideas, developing, editing, check those spellings, check your sentence structure. But there's actually no reason why a student has to do that simultaneously. And I'm certain that there are potentially hundreds of students out there, thousands of students, who shut down because they're so frightened of the editing and the polishing that actually stifles that ability to capture the idea first. So some of you may already be doing something similar, but if not, explore CAKE, explore it with your students, get them to reflect on it as a metacognitive tool, and combine it with other things that you might be doing in terms of thinking about engaging with a page, etc. So just for a couple of moments now, just again to pass over to you, how could you use cake in your own context? So again, think about here, writing that your activities that you're already engaged in with your students, where actually you're thinking, gosh, I could, draw on something like the cake model to help my students capture those exciting ideas. Or again, with your own learning, as I've just shared with you, that I would use this when producing an assignment or an essay or an article. So if anyone would like to share any of their thoughts, or just have a moment again to reflect on that in terms of how you might use this. Yeah, lovely suggestions there with brainstorming. Yeah, you might want to get students to, and like you say, combine this with something like a mind map. Yeah, great point. This can be used for science research. I use this a lot with students who don't like particularly writing and can use it at degree level for scientists, and they find it easier to generate their ideas and then tidy those ideas up.
Yeah, just to add to that, as a science practitioner previously, I would totally agree that it really helps students before they actually get their hands on any equipment to really take a step back and think about what their method is and why they might be doing steps in a particular order. And this doesn't just apply to science, it could apply to other sort of hands-on practical projects as well, for example, art or design. I think it's not just specific to particular subjects, which is why we're sharing these ideas with you today.
Yeah, really exciting, and it's lovely because it just inspires us, because it just makes me think, gosh, there's even more strategies I can draw on myself. So that's brilliant, thank you. Okay, because we're a little short on time, please do spend a little bit more time reflecting on this after the session. But yes, we're just going to move on now to a quick summary of what we've covered so far today. So passing over to you, Karen.
Thanks, Abby. So yeah, a whistle-stop tour of well-doing and just a brief foray into all of the different strategies that Abby and I have been working on and thinking about how they can translate into different contexts. So we introduced you to well-doing at the start, and then we've shown you 3 different ways in which you could potentially embed well-doing into the classroom: through comfortable learning, through thinking spaces, and through cake. We'll shortly be moving to questions and discussion, but we just want to summarise and re-emphasise a few points which actually relate back to the keynote, which we hope that you've all had time to watch. So the idea here is that we've shown you that different processes can lead to the same outcome in terms of learning. This can help all learners, regardless of whether they are labelled as having special educational needs, because we can look for patterns of difficulty and offer students a range of different well-doing strategies, which they can then think about and actually just take a few risks with. And when you're scaffolding that environment for students to take risks, as was spoken about in the keynote, and to explore themselves and explore what they need in terms of their learning and how their learning can be supported through different strategies. So this idea of you scaffolding the environment that provides students with multiple ways for students to access their learning, but you don't do them all, but you provide those opportunities for students and give them the ability to be flexible and adaptable, and to act on to take the opportunity to act in a way that suits their own particular needs, i.e. encouraging them to be metacognitive and to think about thinking and to think about their learning. So as I said, this really encourages them to reflect, so to harness those Cambridge attributes, to become lifelong learners, and to think about what works best. So the onus isn't on the teacher to do these strategies, but the onus is to introduce students to these and to help students to reflect and to see what will work for them, and to create that safe space for students to take risks, to enable your students to explore, as we spoke about, or as we heard about, sorry, from the keynote speaker. As we've said, most of these changes can be applied in a classroom setting, but you as a teacher have control and you can reflect on which strategies you think would be best to share with your learners. But remember we spoke about how small changes can lead to big impact. As Abby said before, when we're writing, we'll literally think, hold on a minute, we're not getting anywhere, we're putting in lots of effort, not making much progress. Let's switch to paper rather than the screen. Let's get a different coloured piece of paper. Let's write on post-it notes. Let's move things around rather than having things linear. And these have a big impact, and they're just small changes which can be applied in many different contexts across many different classrooms. So that leads us on now then to thinking about your questions and discussion.
So there's a lovely question there to begin that we can start off with about attention, okay, and this is something that's very challenging, and I think what we would try to encourage you to do here is to develop a very holistic approach to thinking about a student's attention and how we can boost that. So it might be, as we've said, that there are certain things within the environment that are impacting on that student's ability to concentrate and focus on their learning. And that could be particularly the case if the classroom is very busy. So you might want to work openly and honestly with the student to identify small strategies that can boost attention and focus. And that is wide-ranging, as we've just demonstrated with well-doing. It could include something like a student saying, well, I actually think better when I move. Well, you can't be running around the classroom, but how could we incorporate, I've even had a student with a pencil case on their desk with some fabric that they could rub, and you wouldn't believe the difference that had in terms of engaging the student, helping them to concentrate. But you might also help the student work in something like a table as opposed to a mind map where it's broken down. Okay. Another really nice question there from Jen about promoting metacognition for online classes. I think, I don't know about you, Karen, but I would say my take on the whole kind of pandemic and teaching online is that the issues or challenges students face tend to be even more exaggerated in the online context. So these things are even more important. And I found that, I'm just going to give an example with my own daughter, where she was doing all her learning online, but I really encouraged her to engage with paper and pen, to actually change the way in which she was learning and build in some variety there. Okay, so I think you could take the same approaches, but you will find that they will be even more important in an online setting.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think just simple things. So on my screen, I always have the nightlight on, so I can't stand the brightness of the white screen. So it has the filter, and that really helps me because I find the brightness too distracting. So changing the brightness, changing the volume, encouraging students to think about if they want to wear a headset or whether they want to listen to sound through the speakers can be really beneficial. And again, just giving your students options and allowing them to stop and think. So could there be multiple ways in which they can engage with your learning? Could they engage synchronously in the classroom? So could they engage in a discussion there and then? But could there be opportunities for students to follow up through a Menti or through things like a Jamboard or a Miro board where they have the virtual post-it notes that they can move around? It's just providing different options for your students and encouraging them to think, to stop and think about what will work best for them. And can I just add a question about the assessment? Add an answer about the assessment question that I've seen. You don't necessarily need to change your assessment types. So we spoke a bit about process versus product. So you can still get all students to the same end product, but they can be, you can scaffold that learning process in different ways. So I've got students at the moment who are currently preparing for an essay, but to prepare for that essay, we don't just write. We draw, we discuss, we map things out, we do concept maps, but at the end of the day, they will all write the essay, but actually they've got different ways in which they can structure their thinking, like cake, for example, but it's still the same assessment. So you don't have to be thinking of multiple ways to do assessment differently to meet all of your students' needs either, but think about how the process to get to the success in that assessment might need to be different for different students.
It's really interesting. There's a lot of questions that are focusing on, as we say, as I said at the very start, those things that teachers can find challenging in a classroom, where it can appear that lots of the learners have multiple challenges that they're facing. And it was just really to reiterate that point, that this approach can enable you to simultaneously meet the needs of those students. By providing the student with choice, by boosting their own autonomy, so that students think differently. You wouldn't believe of students that Karen and I have worked with who are older and have the language to reflect now on their learning and are able to say, gosh, I never realised environment impacted on me so much. If only I'd known that when I was younger. Or, gosh, I'd never realised that the space on the page shaped my actual thinking and my concentration. So the approach can help with, I've noticed somebody's identified social isolation, somebody else has identified working with learners with SEN. The approach can be applied to multiple contexts. And it's as we say, it's the moving between those strategies and the layering of those strategies that gives the student that control and boosts student autonomy and resilience.
Great, I think we've reached our time, haven't we? James, are there anything, do we need to wrap up in a particular way?
No, I don't think, unless you have any final kind of closing thoughts based on the questions. I think that's it from our side.
Okay, I guess we'd just like to say thanks for everyone for participating, for sharing their ideas, and we hope that by sharing ideas, this can stimulate further conversations, which will be beneficial for you to reflect on these well-doing strategies and think about how they might apply to your own particular context. But yeah, it's been really great to be here today and to share our ideas and to see that some of you have found them quite useful and actually given us some ideas as well, which is really great.
I was just going to add to that, Karen. I think for me, that's why teaching and learning is just so exciting, because that journey never stops. We're always problem solving and we're always generating new ways to support thinking and learning. So thank you so much for sharing your ideas with us today as well. Brilliant.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you. We'll end the recording there. Thank you.